August 15, 1944. Just before sunrise, the Mediterranean was a sheet of dark steel. On the horizon, hundreds of American ships drifted in absolute silence. Amphibious transports, destroyers, cruisers, and the flat silhouettes of escort carriers. To the German observers on the cliffs near Toulon, it looked like a storm forming far offshore. But to the men standing on the decks, rifles strapped across their chests, this was the moment that would reshape the war in southern Europe. The invasion that was about to begin had no beaches as famous as Normandy, no grand speeches attached to it, and no cinematic mythology. Yet the engineers, planners, and commanders behind this operation believed something quietly radical, that the quickest path into the heart of Germany was not from the north, but through the forgotten back door of France. This was Operation Dragoon. Its purpose was deceptively simple: to land American forces on the French Riviera, seize the ports of Toulon and Marseille, push rapidly up the Rhône Valley, and collapse the entire German southern flank. But behind that simplicity was an engineering challenge of staggering scale, one that required the United States Army, Navy, and Marine Corps to synchronize their movements across more than 150 miles of coastline, under the watch of German artillery and fortified hilltops. Months earlier, Dragoon had been little more than a controversial idea. Churchill opposed it fiercely, arguing that the Mediterranean had already consumed too many resources. Eisenhower insisted it was essential. The Allies needed a deep water port, and they needed one fast. Supplies flowing through Normandy were not enough to sustain the advance toward Germany. Without another entry point, the Allied armies risked stalling. The United States chose to act. To execute Dragoon, American planners created one of the most meticulously engineered amphibious assaults of the entire war. Radar-equipped destroyers choreographed naval fire with mathematical precision. Underwater demolition teams mapped German obstacles in the moonlight. Navy Seabees rebuilt landing ramps directly onto the decks of LSTs, giving armored vehicles a faster path ashore. Airborne divisions rehearsed night jumps to seize crossroads deep inland, creating chaos behind German lines before the first landing craft touched the sand. And at the center of it all were the beaches themselves: Cavalier, Saint-Tropez, Saint-Raphael. Names associated with postcards and summer quiet. Yet on that morning, they would become the hinge upon which the entire southern campaign would turn. As the first landing craft began to lower into the water, a Marine radio operator reportedly whispered, "We're opening a door no one remembers exists." He wasn't wrong. For years, the German command had focused on the Atlantic Wall, convinced that any decisive Allied invasion would strike from the north. Few expected a large-scale American assault on the sun-drenched coast of Provence. What the Germans saw as a secondary theater, the United States saw as an opportunity: a straight, unobstructed corridor into southeastern France, bypassing the worst defenses of the Reich. A corridor that led directly to the industrial arteries feeding the German war machine. But at that moment, on the decks of the transport ships, none of that was guaranteed. Everything depended on timing, engineering, and the ability to coordinate air, sea, and land forces with near-perfect precision. The storm was about to break. Long before the first landing craft lowered into the Mediterranean, Operation Dragoon existed only as a series of blueprints, thick binders filled with aerial photographs, tide charts, German order of battle estimates, and engineering diagrams detailing every ramp, causeway, and landing zone. In Washington, London, and Algiers, American planners wrestled with a difficult truth: Dragoon was not just another amphibious assault. It was a logistical gambit that had to succeed quickly, or it would fail completely. The heart of the challenge was geography. The French Riviera was beautiful, but unforgiving. Many beaches were narrow, backed by steep hills or stone promenades built for tourists, not tanks. The German Army Group G had used this terrain well, positioning artillery in terraced slopes that overlooked every natural landing point. Even a perfect landing could turn into a trap if armored vehicles hesitated for just a few minutes. To overcome this, engineers of the U.S. Navy and Army worked side by side to redesign the landing concept. The Higgins boats would carry infantry in the first wave, but the heavier punch, the Sherman tanks, bulldozers, half-tracks, and artillery, had to come ashore almost immediately behind them. Delay was unacceptable. So the Navy modified dozens of LSTs with custom-built ramps extending several meters beyond the bow doors, allowing armored vehicles to descend directly into shallower water. It was a simple idea on paper, but the execution required thousands of hours of welding, testing, and recalibration. The ramps had to be strong enough to hold a 30-ton tank, but light enough to avoid capsizing the vessel when deployed. Engineers tested each ramp repeatedly in North African ports, adjusting the angle by fractions of an inch. One witness wrote that the ramps did not look elegant, but they were the difference between momentum and catastrophe. The airborne component added another layer of complexity. The 1st Airborne Task Force, a unique blend of U.S. and British units, would drop inland hours before the beach assault, seize roads and bridges, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. But the drop zones were surrounded by olive groves, vineyards, and winding roads carved centuries earlier. Precision was vital. Air Force pilots spent nights studying reconnaissance photos under red lamps, memorizing river bends and road shapes instead of relying solely on instruments. Pathfinders tested radar beacons in secrecy, calibrating them to cut through the coastal haze that often settled on Provence during the summer months. Instructors warned the paratroopers that the terrain would be confusing: no wide fields, no flat plains, only scattered villages and dark ridgelines. Meanwhile, offshore, the U.S. Navy rehearsed what would become one of the most synchronized bombardments of the Mediterranean theater. Destroyers were assigned specific grid squares, each marked by a pattern of rocks, farm walls, or rooftop colors visible only from the sea. Their orders were strict: each ship fired not on intuition, but on geometry. Naval fire would be the scalpel that carved the landing corridors open. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of the preparation was the secrecy surrounding it. Dragoon had to appear smaller, less threatening, almost secondary. Allied intelligence flooded German channels with fake signals suggesting only minor raids. The Germans, overstretched and under-resourced, believed it. They expected harassment, not a full-scale invasion. By late July 1944, the machinery of Dragoon was fully assembled: 35,000 landing troops, thousands of airborne soldiers, 500 ships, hundreds of aircraft, and a network of engineers who had reshaped every technical detail from ramp length to glide path altitude. Still, one question remained unanswered. Would all these moving parts align when the first boots touched the sand? Or would Dragoon fracture under the weight of its own complexity? The Mediterranean winds would soon decide. On the night of August 14, 1944, the Mediterranean coastline appeared deceptively calm. The warm winds sweeping across Provence carried the scent of pine forests and dry earth. Nothing that suggested an invasion fleet was gathering just beyond the horizon. In quiet hilltop villages, German sentries smoked their last cigarettes before rotating off watch, unaware that thousands of American soldiers were already in motion. Far offshore, under strict blackout conditions, the U.S. Navy formed its assault groups with geometric precision. From the decks of LSTs and troop transports, the coastline was visible only as a thin line of darker black against the night sky. To keep the enemy unaware, the ships moved at barely perceptible speed, engines throttled low, forming an enormous but silent armada. Sailors later recalled that even conversation felt out of place. Every whisper seemed too loud, too risky. At 2,200 hours, the command ships conducted their final radio silence checks. Every vessel switched to hand signals, signal lamps, and prearranged timings. By then, the fleet was locked into its approach pattern, and there was no turning back. Operation Dragoon had left the realm of planning and entered the fragile domain of execution. German coastal defenses were alert, but not alarmed. Their reconnaissance flights had been limited by fuel shortages, and their ground-based radars were unreliable, frequently disrupted by Allied jamming. Army Group G, commanded by General Friedrich Wiese, believed the Allies were preparing another feint. Even the presence of Allied battleships earlier that week had been interpreted as pressure, not preparation. But U.S. commanders understood that even a partial German reaction could complicate everything. The beaches selected for Dragoon were narrow. A few well-placed artillery pieces could stall the first waves and trap vehicles on the shoreline. So in the last hours before dawn, the U.S. Navy launched a carefully crafted deception. From the west, a small flotilla of destroyers fired sporadic illumination rounds toward a non-landing sector, mimicking reconnaissance probes. To the east, fast torpedo boats darted toward the coast, then veered away, leaving radar echoes that suggested a larger force. In the center, the carriers held their air wings in complete silence. No combat air patrols, no probing flights, nothing that could reveal their strength too early. Meanwhile, aboard the troop transports, final preparations unfolded with quiet intensity. Soldiers checked canteens, tightened straps, and re-examined maps they had memorized days earlier. Marines rehearsed the disembarkation steps one last time, moving like silhouettes under red lights. Chaplains passed between rows of equipment, offering brief words to men who tried to mask nerves with calm breathing. In makeshift command posts aboard the flagship USS Katoktine, planners monitored weather reports and wind patterns. A slight shift in the Mediterranean breeze could alter the landing conditions. A sudden swell could delay the tank-bearing LSTs by minutes that might cost American lives. Meteorologists reported stable skies, but everyone knew how fragile that stability was. Shortly after midnight, the airborne forces began their movement. C-47s warmed their engines in North African and Italian airfields, forming long black chains against the night. Their mission was as delicate as it was dangerous: secure crossroads, disrupt German communication, and create enough confusion to fracture the response before it could solidify. As the aircraft lifted into the darkness, the pilots kept lights off and throttles steady, navigating by coastline outlines and radar beacons placed earlier by pathfinders. Below them, German units were only partially mobilized. Many formations had been stripped to reinforce the Normandy front. Others were under strength or recovering from months of partisan warfare in southeastern France. The Germans expected harassment, saboteurs, isolated strikes, not a synchronized multi-arm assault. At 0300 hours, the U.S. Navy finalized the fire plan. Every ship received its target list, bunkers marked by rooftop tiles, artillery nests identified by the angles of terraced vineyards, machine gun placements mapped using shadows from aerial photos. The level of detail was unlike anything attempted earlier in the Mediterranean. Then, just before the first hint of dawn, a message passed quietly along the fleet. Landing H-hour confirmed. The invasion of southern France was moments away. And though the Germans still stared into the night unaware, the storm that had been assembling for months was now gliding toward the shore. At 5:45, a faint gray line appeared over the Mediterranean. For a moment, the sea and sky were indistinguishable, two vast, silent surfaces waiting to collide. Then, without warning, the darkness fractured. The first American destroyers opened fire. The bombardment was not a roar at first, but a sequence of precise, timed detonations, each shell following a trajectory measured down to the meter. From the decks of the leading destroyers, the coastal hills of Provence lit up like a map suddenly illuminated. Vineyards, stone terraces, and narrow roads flashed into existence under the bursts of naval fire. Every ship had its assignment. The USS Brooklyn targeted fortified slopes above Cavalier. The USS Philadelphia swept German gun nests west of St. Raphael. Smaller destroyers, equipped with advanced SG radar, adjusted fire minute by minute, using data relayed from reconnaissance aircraft circling far above the haze. The effect was surgical. This was not the chaotic naval gunfire of earlier Mediterranean campaigns. It was a calculated dissection of a coastline. From German bunkers overlooking the beaches, the scene must have appeared unreal. For weeks, their horizon had been empty. Now, in a single instant, it was filled with silhouettes of ships. So many that some gunners later admitted they did not know where to aim first. And the bombardment was only beginning. At 6 o'clock, the first waves of rocket-firing LCTs advanced toward the beaches. These were experimental platforms, flat-decked vessels carrying banks of rockets designed to saturate defensive positions seconds before the infantry approached. When they fired, the sound rolled across the water like tearing metal. Hundreds of rockets streaked toward the coastline, leaving long white trails before plunging into the sand and rocks. Behind them came the landing craft loaded with the 3rd, 36th, and 45th Infantry Divisions of the U.S. 7th Army. The men aboard could feel the concussions through the hull plates. Some later said it was like descending into a thunderstorm made of steel. From the command ship, General Alexander Patch watched through binoculars as the shoreline shifted from darkness to flame. His staff tracked each phase: naval bombardment, rocket saturation, initial waves. Every movement depended on the one before it. If a single German battery survived in the wrong place, the assault could slow enough for reserves to counterattack. But the Germans were already in disarray. Many communication lines had been cut by airborne troops hours earlier, and the saturation fire hammered key observation posts. Reports later showed that several German command centers were unable to determine the main landing site until nearly 20 minutes after H hour, an eternity in amphibious warfare. At 6:15, the first Higgins boats neared Green Beach at Cavalier Bay. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so, as if the Mediterranean had chosen to cooperate for this one morning. When the craft dropped their ramps, infantrymen charged forward, boots splashing into the shallows, rifles raised. They expected machine gun fire immediately, but for a few seconds, the only sound was the rumble of distant naval guns. Then came the first German response: sporadic, inaccurate bursts from a machine gun nest higher on the ridge. U.S. destroyers reacted instantly. A single broadside silenced the position, sending dust and debris cascading down the hillside. By 6:30, U.S. Royal Engineers and Navy demolition teams were already clearing obstacles on red and blue beaches. Shallow trenches, anti-vehicle stakes, mines, they had been placed hastily by German troops who never believed a major landing would strike here. Many were incomplete or badly camouflaged. The Americans moved quickly, marking safe lanes with colored panels for the incoming armor. And the armor was coming. At 6:50, the first modified LSTs dropped their forward ramps. Shermans, half-tracks, and bulldozers rolled directly into knee-deep water, engines roaring, treads grinding across the sand. It was the moment the engineers had envisioned during endless rehearsals, and now it unfolded with remarkable precision. The German defenders, stunned by the concentration of fire, had little chance to mount an organized resistance. The carefully engineered momentum of Dragoon was taking hold. The Americans had not only gained a foothold, they had opened the door the title of this documentary promised. A door into southern France. A door the Germans had left unlocked. And the 7th Army was stepping through it. By 7:30, the sun had risen high enough to reveal the full scale of the American landings. What had been a faint, scattered glow on the water an hour earlier was now a vast choreography of engines, waves, aircraft, and advancing troops. The U.S. 7th Army had not only reached the beaches, it was beginning to expand them. The crucial first step was to secure a defensible perimeter before German counterattacks could form. Amphibious operations lived or died in these first hours. A misleadingly calm shoreline could turn disastrous if enemy units managed to regroup and isolate the landing forces. American commanders knew this intimately. The memory of Anzio's near failure still haunted planners. Infantry units moved inland with a sense of urgency built on months of training. The 3rd Infantry Division pressed through vineyards and low stone walls, clearing scattered pockets of resistance. German troops, caught off guard and fragmented, fired sporadically from hill slopes but lacked coordinated fields of fire. Many had been placed in anti-paratrooper positions facing inland, not toward the sea. Meanwhile, engineers were everywhere. Combat engineers cleared mines, filled anti-vehicle trenches, and carved rough pathways through the beach exits. Bulldozers, often among the first vehicles ashore, pushed obstacles aside with methodical force, transforming tight, twisting access points into corridors wide enough for armor. The French terrain, beautiful to the eye, was hostile to mechanized movement. Terraced hillsides and narrow coastal roads threatened to bottleneck troops if not widened immediately. Behind the engineers came the Shermans. Their arrival marked a decisive shift in the rhythm of the assault. Infantrymen who had been advancing cautiously now had armored silhouettes rising behind them, mobile firepower capable of punching through fortified farmhouses or hilltop gun positions. One tank commander later described the feeling: "The beach vanished the moment we moved. It was just dust, stone walls, and the next rise. Provence is pretty from a distance, but up close it's almost made to trap a tank." Communication remained fragile. Radios crackled with interference caused by the coastal humidity, and several battalions relied on runners or colored panels to signal their progress. To offset this, naval gunfire officers embedded with the infantry established visual signals to the destroyers offshore. When a German position revealed itself, usually through a burst of automatic fire, American spotters flagged its coordinates using bright panels. Within minutes, a multi-gun salvo shattered the target. This integration of sea-based fire support with ground maneuver was one of Dragoon's defining strengths. On more rugged coastlines, such coordination might have been impossible. But here, the combination of elevated German positions and open lines of sight gave the U.S. Navy a clear firing picture throughout the morning. What could have been deadly ambush terrain became a geographic disadvantage for the defenders. To the east, the airborne units were accomplishing their own miracle. Dropping into terrain far from ideal, many paratroopers had landed scattered among pine forests and sloping fields. Yet their training, and perhaps a measure of luck, brought them together quickly. They seized key crossroads near Lemuy, blocking German reinforcements trying to descend from the interior. Cut off, confused, and unsure of the scale of the landings, German commanders hesitated to commit their reserves. Every hour they delayed allowed the Americans to strengthen their hold on the coast. Back on the beaches, the second and third waves were coming ashore in steady rhythm. Supply teams unloaded ammunition, water, radios, and medical equipment. Casualties were treated in improvised aid stations under camouflaged tents. The landing areas, once narrow and fragile, were developing depth, lines of men, vehicles, and supplies knitting together into something resilient. The foothold was no longer theoretical. It was becoming an anchor point, a gateway. By midday, the momentum of Dragoon was unmistakable. The U.S. forces were not merely ashore, they were moving inland faster than many planners had dared hope. The Germans, still disorganized and misled by deception efforts, had not yet mounted a concentrated response. The door to southern France had swung open. The question now was how fast the Americans could push through it, and how far that opening would reach into the interior. By early afternoon on August 15th, the terrain behind the beaches had become a mosaic of advancing units, improvised command posts, and the dust clouds of armored columns pushing inland. The U.S. 7th Army now faced the true test of Dragoon, moving beyond the narrow coastal strip and securing the open ground that would lead into the Rhône Valley. The first serious German resistance emerged near the town of Lemuy, a strategic crossroads that controlled access to the hinterland. Earlier that morning, airborne forces had fought scattered engagements across vineyards and tree lines, gradually assembling into cohesive groups despite their dispersed landings. Their mission had always been ambitious: seize Lemuy, prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast, and hold until the beach forces could link up. Now the weight of that responsibility became clear. As American infantry advanced inland, they encountered defenses that were far more prepared than those on the beaches. German units belonging to the 148th Infantry Division had entrenched themselves along ridges and within the thick Mediterranean scrub, using the natural folds of the terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. These troops lacked heavy armor but were experienced in defensive warfare, and their discipline showed. The 3rd Infantry Division moved along a narrow axis edged by low stone walls and groves of twisted olive trees. Machine gun bursts cracked across the valley, and mortars began to fall with unsettling accuracy. For the first time since H-hour, American progress slowed. Forward observers called for naval fire support, but the inland ridges were beginning to cut off direct lines of sight to the sea. Destroyers could still engage some positions, but only indirectly, using mathematical corrections from the infantry. The bombardments landed with impressive precision, though each strike required more time. Dragoon's greatest advantage, coastal firepower, was gradually diminishing as the troops moved away from the water. To compensate, American batteries came ashore rapidly. Field artillery teams rushed to set up 105 mm howitzers in improvised gun pits a short distance inland. Their fire missions began almost immediately, creating rolling barges that allowed infantry to advance between bursts. Dust and smoke drifted across the valley, the landscape alternating between blinding brightness and sudden shadow. Near Lemuy, the airborne forces were locked in a tense standoff. German troops had fortified the outskirts of the town, turning farmhouses into strongpoints and blocking roads with fallen trees and overturned carts. The paratroopers, lightly equipped, could not mount a full assault without reinforcement. Instead, they tightened their perimeter, using captured German radios to monitor enemy movements. By mid-afternoon, the beach forces closed the gap. Shermans from the 191st Tank Battalion pushed inland, their engines echoing across the valley. When they reached the airborne perimeter, some paratroopers reportedly cheered, not because the tanks were unexpected, but because they arrived sooner than any planner had predicted. The combined force moved on Lemuy with deliberate coordination. Tanks advanced in staggered formation, firing high-explosive rounds into fortified positions, while airborne infantry cleared the adjacent fields and orchards. German defenders resisted with determination, but they lacked anti-tank weaponry in adequate numbers. By late afternoon, the Americans had breached the town's outskirts. The fall of Lemuy was more than a tactical victory, it was the key to Dragoon's operational tempo. With the crossroads secured, the main routes into southern France opened. German reserves attempting to move south ran into roadblocks, demolished bridges, and patrols of airborne troops who had mastered the terrain during the long morning hours. To the west, other American units pushed toward Saint Raphael, encountering similar pockets of resistance. The Germans, though disorganized, were fighting with the ferocity of troops who knew they were isolated. But their lines were thin, their communication fractured, and their ability to counterattack severely limited. What emerged from these inland battles was a rapidly developing pattern. U.S. forces moved faster than anticipated, German responses were slower than feared, and the carefully synchronized structure of Dragoon was holding together under the stress of real combat. By evening, the foothold had become a corridor, narrow, fragile in places, but undeniably open. The Americans were no longer fighting for the beach. They were fighting for the gateway into the south of France. The morning of August 16th brought a new phase of Operation Dragoon. The beaches had been secured, Lemuy had fallen, and the airborne forces had formed a stable interior line. Now the 7th Army faced its next objective, widening the inland corridor before German reserves could reorganize. American commanders understood the stakes. A narrow lodgment, even one firmly held, could be severed if German units managed to concentrate along its flanks. The Germans had learned this lesson repeatedly on the Eastern Front, where narrow penetrations were often countered by sharp, well-timed counterattacks. The U.S. planners intended to prevent any such possibility. Expanding the corridor required attacking in multiple directions simultaneously. The 36th Infantry Division pushed west toward Draguignan, while the 45th Division moved north into more challenging terrain, low mountain ridges that offered excellent defensive lines for any German units still capable of fighting. The 3rd Division, already battle-tested from Sicily and Italy, advanced in the center, driving toward the Argens River. Each axis had its own difficulties. The roads were narrow, winding through tight passes and bordered by thick Mediterranean scrub. German rearguards used this terrain skillfully, launching short, sharp engagements before pulling back along predetermined escape routes. These tactics slowed the American advance without risking major losses. To counter this, American units adopted a rhythm that combined mobility, firepower, and engineering precision. Armored reconnaissance vehicles probed ahead, marking ambush sites. Shermans followed at controlled intervals, supported by half-tracks carrying infantry ready to dismount at a moment's notice. Artillery teams leapfrogged forward, establishing new firing positions every few miles. The terrain dictated the pace. In many places, German machine guns fired from terraced ridges that had existed since Roman times, each level offering a perfect vantage point. Clearing these defenses required infantry squads to ascend steep stone steps under fire, using grenades and rifle fire to root out entrenched defenders. But as the day progressed, resistance started to crack. One reason was simple. German command structure in southern France was dissolving. Army Group G was stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, with divisions under strength, low on vehicles, and suffering severe fuel shortages. Their communications had been fractured by airborne operations and resistance sabotage. Reports reached German headquarters hours late, sometimes not at all. Orders were confused, contradictory, or outdated by the time they reached frontline units. American troops noticed it almost immediately. German defenders fought hard when engaged, but their positions often lacked depth. There were few secondary lines, few coordinated artillery strikes, almost no armored counterattacks. Everything suggested an army trying to buy time, not hold ground. Still, the U.S. advance was not effortless. Near the town of Les Arcs, German units used the natural bottleneck of the valley to slow the 3rd Division. Mortar teams hidden in the tree lines fired with surprising accuracy, forcing American companies to maneuver carefully. Engineers worked constantly, filling craters, repairing culverts, and widening the narrow tracks so supply trucks could maintain the flow of ammunition and water. As the afternoon heat rose, the corridor widened further. The 36th Division captured Dragoon by late afternoon, securing a logistical hub that had served as a German administrative center. Captured documents revealed a troubling picture. Many German units had begun withdrawing north even before the Americans reached their positions. They were under strict orders from higher command to avoid encirclement at all costs. This validated the American operational design. By landing deep in southern France, the 7th Army had forced Army Group G into a dilemma: defend every inch and be destroyed, or retreat and abandon the coastline entirely. Meanwhile, to the east, French resistance fighters emerged from hiding, guiding American patrols through backroads and reporting German movements. Their intelligence proved invaluable, helping the U.S. divisions bypass strongpoints and strike at the seams of the retreating defenses. By nightfall on August 16, the corridor was no longer a narrow thrust. It had become a wide, stable front stretching dozens of kilometers inland. Supply lines were flowing, armored columns were maneuvering, and the airborne divisions were fully integrated into the main force. Operation Dragoon had moved beyond its fragile beginnings. It was now a rolling offensive, one that was beginning to accelerate. By August 17, the landscape of southern France was changing rapidly under the pressure of American movement. What began as a narrow landing corridor was now becoming a vast operational front stretching across dozens of kilometers. The 7th Army was no longer fighting for footholds, it was maneuvering for dominance. The primary objective was clear: reach the Rhône River. Not just to cross it, but to seize control of the main north-south artery running through southeastern France. If the Americans could reach the Rhône quickly, they could split the German forces, trap elements of Army Group G, and cut off any hope of an orderly withdrawal towards central France. To achieve this, the U.S. forces needed speed, relentless, sustained speed. The 3rd Infantry Division pushed northwest in long, dust-choked columns. Shermans led the advance, their engines roaring as they climbed gradual inclines and rolled across ancient farm roads never designed for armored traffic. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry, engineers, and communications teams who worked non-stop to maintain pace. The terrain favored the Germans in theory: wooded slopes, narrow roads, valleys that could become killing zones. But the German command structure was unraveling faster than the terrain could compensate. Intercepted radio transmissions revealed confusion, contradictory orders, lost units, misplaced battalions, and commanders unsure of where the main American thrust would fall. This confusion stemmed partly from how Dragoon had unfolded. The landings were fast, synchronized, and much larger than expected. The airborne drops had severed key roads, and French resistance groups, now operating openly, were sabotaging German fuel dumps, ambushing dispatch riders, and cutting telephone lines. In many instances, American units advanced into towns just hours after resistance fighters had driven out German rearguards. By late morning, the 36th Infantry Division reached the outskirts of Barjols, encountering a German defense that was stronger than anything seen since the beaches. Machine gun nests, well placed in the slopes above the town, created overlapping fields of fire across the approach routes. Mortars bracketed the roads, forcing the Americans to maneuver off the beaten paths and climb rugged terrain under fire. Here, the operational design of Dragoon revealed its flexibility. Instead of hammering directly into the defensive line, American commanders redirected their main thrust westward. While one regiment fixed the German defenders in place with controlled engagements, armored reconnaissance units slipped around the flank, probing for weaknesses. They found them quickly. The German positions, though well sighted, lacked depth. Once the flankers reached the rear of the defensive ridge, the German line crumbled. By early afternoon, the Americans were through. This pattern repeated itself along the front. German resistance spiked, then collapsed, spiked again, then fractured under pressure. What the U.S. divisions lacked in terrain familiarity, they made up for with superior mobility, overwhelming firepower, and a logistical system that had been fine-tuned through 2 years of Mediterranean combat. The Navy's influence still mattered, even miles inland. Naval gunfire had broken key defensive positions early that morning, making it easier for the inland divisions to secure the heights and avoid envelopment. Naval aircraft from the carriers offshore flew strike missions deeper into the interior, attacking German convoys attempting to regroup or escape toward the Rhône. The speed of the American advance was becoming its greatest weapon. As the sun began to lower in the late afternoon sky, American scouts reached elevated ridges that offered a distant view of the Rhône Valley. Through the haze, they could see the terrain flattening toward the great river. It was a sight that electrified the command posts. Once the 7th Army reached that valley, the German defensive position in southern France would be compromised on a strategic level. And the Americans were nearly there. At dusk, reports reached General Patch. Multiple German formations were abandoning positions and withdrawing toward the Rhône in disorganized columns. Some were burning equipment. Others were simply leaving it behind. Many lacked fuel entirely and were marching north on foot. Dragoon was no longer an amphibious operation or a beachhead campaign. It was becoming a pursuit. The race for the Rhône had begun, and the Germans were already losing it. By August 18, the German defensive system in southern France was no longer functioning as a coherent whole. What had been intended as a layered defense, anchored on key towns, crossroads and ridgelines, had disintegrated into scattered pockets of resistance separated by long stretches of empty road. For the U.S. 7th Army, this was the moment where operational maneuver mattered more than frontal assault. The Americans pressed forward in multiple columns, each designed to exploit the widening gaps in the German line. Armored scouts led the way, moving fast, often far ahead of the main body. Their mission was simple: find the seams, identify where German units were withdrawing, and strike before those forces could regroup. The speed of the pursuit began to reveal scenes rarely witnessed in the European theater. Along rural roads, American troops passed abandoned German trucks with empty fuel tanks, their crews having marched away in long, tired columns. Field kitchens were still warm. Maps were pinned to trees, left behind in the rush. Artillery pieces sat in ditches, their breeches removed to prevent capture. For all its discipline, Army Group G was suffering from a problem that no field manual could solve. There was no time. The Americans were advancing faster than German staff officers could issue orders. And every hour lost meant another town falling, another bridge captured, another route closed. U.S. commanders recognized the moment. Instead of pausing to consolidate, they accelerated. The 3rd Infantry Division pushed toward the lower Rhône Valley, its infantry riding on tank decks or in the backs of half-tracks to conserve strength. When German machine gun nests fired, the Shermans pivoted instantly, returning high-explosive rounds that shattered makeshift strongpoints. The momentum never stopped. To the west, the 36th Division advanced through the foothills toward the river, fighting sporadic engagements with small German detachments attempting to delay the inevitable. These rearguards fought professionally but suffered from broken lines of communication and orders that no longer matched the tactical reality. Many were remnants of units withdrawn from Italy, exhausted and short on supplies. Meanwhile, the 45th Division exploited a key opportunity. Scouts discovered that German units had left the town of Brignoles in haste, leaving only a thin screen to cover their withdrawal. American infantry drove into the town before noon, bypassing resistance and capturing vital crossroads that opened a straight path toward the Rhône. From the air, the scale of the German retreat became even clearer. Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed long columns of vehicles moving north, trucks, wagons, artillery, all packed tightly along roads built centuries earlier. These convoys were vulnerable. Navy aircraft flying from the carriers offshore struck them repeatedly, forcing many German units to scatter into forests or abandon their vehicles entirely. By late afternoon, the situation became critical for the Germans. Field reports from German divisional commanders warned that without immediate reinforcements, entire formations risked encirclement. The problem was that no reinforcements were coming. The northern front, Normandy, consumed every available reserve the German high command could muster. Southern France was expected to hold as long as possible, an order that no longer had meaning. American units, sensing the collapse, intensified their pace. Engineers cleared roadblocks, repaired culverts, and built temporary bridges in record time. Communications teams extended radio lines to keep pace with the advancing spearheads. Supply columns surged forward, delivering fuel, ammunition, and water to units that seldom stopped long enough to rest. Even seasoned American officers were struck by the transformation. In Italy, every ridge cost lives and time. Here, in Provence, the terrain was similar, yet the enemy was unraveling faster than anticipated. The resistance was sharp but disjointed, deadly but isolated. By nightfall, elements of the U.S. 7th Army had reached positions overlooking the Rhône itself. Lights flickered in the valley below, some the glow of burning vehicles, others the lamps of German units trying to retreat northward under cover of darkness. The Americans had achieved the first major breakthrough of Operation Dragoon. They had reached the river that formed the backbone of German movement in southeastern France. But this was only the beginning. Controlling the Rhône meant more than securing a riverbank. It meant slicing the German presence in southern France in half. And the 7th Army was preparing to drive the wedge deeper. On the night of August 18th, as American units established positions on the high ground overlooking the Rhône Valley, the magnitude of what lay before them became unmistakable. The river was not merely a geographic boundary, it was the central artery of German movement through southeastern France. Whoever controlled the Rhône controlled the retreat, the supply lines, and the fate of Army Group G. The 7th Army understood this perfectly. At dawn on August 19th, American columns descended from the hills in long, dust-filled lines. Their objective was twofold: cut the German escape routes and secure crossings that would allow the offensive to push north with unbroken momentum. The Rhône itself was wide, nearly 300 meters in some places, and deep enough to require either intact bridges or engineered crossings. Most bridges, however, were rigged with explosives. German engineers had been ordered to demolish every major crossing once their troops had passed. But the collapse of German command meant that many of those demolitions were delayed, miscommunicated, or executed too late. This created opportunities. Near Le Luc, reconnaissance teams discovered that a key bridge had been abandoned with charges placed but not yet detonated. Engineers rushed forward under sporadic fire, cutting fuses, removing blasting caps, and securing the structure just minutes before a small German demolition squad attempted to return. The bridge provided a crucial crossing point for armor heading toward the valley floor. Farther north, the 36th Infantry Division reached the outskirts of the river town of Montélimar. There, American scouts observed a surreal sight, a seemingly endless column of German vehicles stretching northward, a traffic jam of war. Trucks, staff cars, horse-drawn wagons, and artillery pieces packed the ancient road that hugged the river. The Germans were attempting to escape before the trap closed. U.S. commanders recognized the opportunity instantly. If the Americans could block the valley near Montélimar, they could sever the retreat of tens of thousands of German troops. It would not simply disrupt the German withdrawal, it could annihilate the southern wing of Army Group G. Thus began one of the most critical maneuvers of the entire operation. The 3rd Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 117th Cavalry and French armored units, rushed north along the western bank, seeking high ground that commanded the highway. The heat was intense, the roads narrow, and German rearguards fired from every bend, but the columns pressed forward relentlessly. Artillery units followed closely behind, their howitzers bouncing violently on the uneven roads. When they reached firing positions, they wasted no time. Battery commanders plotted the valley floor below, identifying choke points where German vehicles had clustered in confusion. Within minutes, the first rounds fell among the congested columns, creating panic and slowing the retreat further. German officers pleaded for counterattacks, but their units were fragmented, low on fuel, and strained by days of constant movement. Some battalions attempted to break through American positions but lacked tanks in sufficient numbers. Others simply held their ground to allow the main body to escape. Meanwhile, logistics on the American side were functioning with machine-like precision. Fuel trucks rolled forward to resupply the armored spearheads. Ammunition convoys surged across newly secured bridges, bringing the artillery the shells it needed to keep pressure on the valley. Engineers repaired roads on the fly, widening tight curves and filling bomb craters with whatever material they could find: stone, broken equipment, even sections of destroyed German vehicles. By the afternoon of August 19th, the American grip tightened. Naval aircraft, still flying from carriers anchored miles offshore, joined the pursuit, diving into the valley to strike German columns trapped against the riverbank. Their attacks were devastating. Without air cover and unable to disperse, German vehicles were easy targets. Smoke rose in thick plumes that could be seen for miles. The effect was immediate. The German retreat began to stall. Reports from Army Group G headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Fields' phones crackled with broken messages, commanders begging for fuel, reinforcements, or clear orders. None could be provided. The Rhône was becoming a corridor of destruction. As night fell, American troops held key positions overlooking the valley, artillery firing throughout the darkness to prevent German units from reorganizing. The Germans, exhausted and fragmented, moved north in chaotic waves. Some units abandoned their vehicles entirely and fled on foot. The 7th Army had done it. They had reached the Rhône not as a boundary, but as a weapon. The river that had once promised the Germans an escape route now threatened to become a trap. And the Americans were ready to spring it. By August 20th, the German retreat up the Rhône Valley had turned into a desperate race. Tens of thousands of troops, more than 1,000 vehicles, and the remnants of multiple divisions were streaming north in a chaotic, dust-choked column. Their only hope was to escape through the narrow corridor near Montélimar, a bottleneck where the river pressed against steep hills, leaving little room for maneuver. The U.S. 7th Army intended to close that corridor before the Germans slipped through it. General Lucian Truscott, commanding the U.S. 6th Corps, recognized the opportunity with surgical clarity. If he could seize the high ground east of Montélimar and position artillery overlooking the highway, he could trap a major portion of Army Group G. It would be one of the most decisive operational victories of the Southern campaign. Speed was everything. The 3rd Infantry Division led the race northward, its reconnaissance squadrons pushing ahead along dusty, narrow roads lined with vineyards and broken stone walls. The terrain was uneven and unforgiving. Vehicles overheated. Engines stalled on steep grades. But the Americans kept moving, driven by the knowledge that each hour lost meant more Germans slipping through the narrowing gap. By the afternoon of August 20th, U.S. scouts reached the ridgeline east of Montélimar. The view was astonishing. Below, the Rhône Valley stretched like a funnel, filled with German vehicles, trucks, staff cars, horse-drawn artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, even refugee columns of support staff and auxiliaries. The German withdrawal was no longer a controlled movement. It was an exodus. American artillery officers wasted no time. They established firing positions on the heights, calculating ranges to the valley floor. The first salvos were fired before sunset, high explosive rounds crashing into the packed German roadways. Within minutes, the valley was filled with black smoke, flames, and the screams of engines igniting. This was the beginning of the Montélimar trap. German commanders reacted quickly, ordering elements of the 11th Panzer Division, one of their few armored formations in the region, to counterattack and clear the heights. But they faced a logistical nightmare. Fuel shortages meant many tanks had to be towed or moved in short bursts. Some units arrived piecemeal, unable to coordinate a unified assault. Meanwhile, the Americans held the advantage of position but faced their own challenges. Their forces on the ridge were dangerously small. Truscott had pushed the 3rd Division forward at breakneck speed, and support units lagged behind, stretched thin along the winding roads. Ammunition ran low. Water shortages set in under the brutal August heat. Yet they held. Through the night of August 20th to 21st, the battle intensified. German artillery attempted to dislodge the American guns with counter-battery fire, but their observers struggled to track U.S. positions in the darkness. Mortar teams operated by guesswork, firing blindly into the hills while American spotters adjusted their fire with cold precision. At dawn, German infantry launched probing attacks, testing the American perimeter. These were fierce, close-quarters engagements fought among olive groves and rocky terraces. The Germans were experienced and desperate, using every scrap of cover to advance. But the Americans, though tired, were entrenched and supported by artillery that dominated the valley. Still, the situation was far from secure. American commanders knew that holding the heights required reinforcements, and soon. The 36th Infantry Division and attached French armored units were ordered to move north immediately, their convoys pushing through choking traffic and damaged roads. Engineers worked relentlessly to keep supply routes open, clearing debris and repairing bridges bombed by German rearguards. Time worked against both sides. For the Germans, each hour of delay meant more casualties under American artillery fire and less chance for an organized withdrawal. For the Americans, each hour allowed more German units to accumulate south of Montélimar, increasing the likelihood of a concentrated counterattack. On the evening of August 21st, German forces launched their most determined effort to break the trap. Infantry supported by panzers attacked the American flanks in a coordinated push, aiming to seize a key ridge that anchored the U.S. line. The fighting was brutal, close-range, chaotic, filled with smoke and the flash of tank guns in the twilight. Shermans rushed forward to reinforce the line. Their engines roared as they climbed the rocky slopes, firing point-blank into German positions. Several were hit by Panzerfausts in the advancing dark, but their presence bought critical minutes for American infantry to regroup. By midnight, the German attack had stalled. The Montélimar corridor remained contested, but the Americans were still on the heights. The trap had not fully closed, but it had not broken either. And the Germans could feel it tightening. August 22nd dawned over the Rhône Valley with a heavy, dust-filled haze, evidence of 2 days of continuous artillery fire, burning vehicles, and the grinding movement of tens of thousands of troops. The battlefield around Montélimar had become a layered mosaic of smoke, shattered equipment, and scattered German formations attempting to escape through the shrinking corridor. For the Americans, the challenge was no longer reaching the Rhône. It was holding the heights long enough to turn the German retreat into a rout. The U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, perched along the ridgelines east of the valley, was stretched to its operational limits. Its battalions had been advancing for days with little rest. Ammunition was hauled up the hills in jeeps and half-tracks that groaned under the strain of the terrain. Water was rationed. The August heat hovered over the slopes like a physical force, sapping strength with every hour. Yet the Americans understood the stakes. They held the key choke points that controlled the valley floor. If they abandoned them, the German column could slip north and escape destruction. The Germans understood this too. Army Group G was throwing everything it could at the ridgelines. Units that had been marching north were ordered to reverse direction and join the fight. Artillery pieces that had been hitched to trucks for evacuation were unlimbered and pushed into firing position. Even anti-aircraft guns were lowered and used against ground targets, their rapid-fire shells sweeping across the slopes like cutting blades. At mid-morning, the 11th Panzer Division mounted another assault, a more coordinated effort than previous attempts. Panzers advanced in pairs along the valley floor, firing up at the American positions while infantry climbed the scrub-covered hillsides. The thick brush and terraced vineyards created a maze of angles, making it difficult for American machine gunners to maintain clear lines of fire. The U.S. response was immediate and layered. Forward observers on the crest adjusted artillery fire by seconds and meters, directing 105 mm and 155 mm rounds onto German staging areas. The blasts echoed across the valley, throwing dirt and debris into the air and forcing German infantry to seek cover. But the Germans kept coming, slowly, methodically, as if pulled forward by desperation. Sherman tanks countered where they could, maneuvering along narrow tracks that barely supported their weight. Their guns roared across the valley, but fuel was running low, and resupply convoys were increasingly exposed to German artillery harassing the rear areas. The battle became a test of logistics as much as firepower. American supply lines stretched back through hours of winding roads, some of them under intermittent shell fire. Engineers worked constantly to repair damage, clearing fallen trees and reinforcing culverts that buckled under the weight of armor. To maintain artillery fire, ammunition trucks ran nearly around the clock, weaving through terrain that punished every misjudged turn. By early afternoon, German infantry reached several American outposts on the lower slopes. What followed were close-quarters firefights among boulders, shrubs, and stone terraces. Grenades exploded at distances so short that the fragments barely had time to disperse. Rifle fire cracked through the dry summer air. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and desperate. But the American line held. With coordinated artillery support and the arrival of reinforcements from the 36th Infantry Division, the defenders stabilized their positions. The German attacks, though fierce, lacked the heavy armor and ammunition necessary to break through. Fuel shortages crippled their ability to mount a sustained assault. Many panzers were forced to stop after only a few minutes of movement, their engines idling helplessly as crews hunted for fuel that no longer existed. Still, the Germans refused to collapse. Even as artillery pounded the valley floor, new columns attempted to force their way north. Some moved at night, creeping along country roads and ancient paths in the hope of avoiding American fire. Some abandoned their vehicles and marched through vineyards and woodlands. Others, cornered by American blocking forces, fought savage delaying actions to protect the main retreat. And slowly, steadily, the German column began to shrink. Aerial reconnaissance showed gaps appearing in the once solid line of retreat. Destroyed vehicles formed charred skeletons across the valley floor. Smoke rose for kilometers. Entire battalion groups were missing, pinned down, captured, or scattered into the hills. By the evening of August 22, the Americans still held the heights. They were exhausted, battered, and stretched thin, but unbroken. Their artillery continued to dominate the valley, their infantry held the key ridges, and their armored forces guarded the approaches. The trap was closing. Not fast enough for total destruction, but tight enough to cripple the German presence in the region. The Rhône Valley had become a crucible, and both armies were paying the price. On August 23, the battle for Montélimar reached its breaking point. The Americans held the high ground overlooking the Rhône Valley, but they were dangerously thin along a front that stretched across rugged hills and narrow plateaus. German forces, increasingly desperate, were preparing one final attempt to shatter the American line and reopen their path north. Throughout the night, American patrols reported unusual movement in the valley. Columns quietly repositioning, engines rumbling in the darkness, voices carrying across the fields. These were not the signs of retreat. They were the signs of concentration. At dawn, the attack began. It started with a barrage. German artillery, much of it scavenged from abandoned positions or hastily reassembled, pounded the American ridgelines. Shells exploded among the rocks, sending shards of limestone and hot metal across foxholes and trenches. The Americans hugged the earth, waiting for the infantry assault they knew would follow. It came minutes later. German grenadiers surged up the slopes in coordinated waves. These were seasoned troops, many from the 11th Panzer Division and veteran infantry regiments. They advanced with grim purpose, firing from the hip, dropping into cover, then advancing again. Mortar teams followed closely behind, adjusting fire with precision that belied their exhaustion. The pressure was enormous. On the American right flank, a thin line of riflemen from the 3rd Infantry Division absorbed the first impact. They fired steadily, but the slope worked against them. German troops used every fold of terrain for cover. Within minutes, American squads were calling for reinforcements, their ammunition running low. Shermans maneuvered forward to support them, clattering over the rocky paths with engines roaring. Their high-explosive rounds tore into German clusters, halting parts of the assault, but only temporarily. The Germans kept coming. Meanwhile, the valley floor erupted with movement. German columns that had been retreating now turned to reinforce the attack. Trucks dumped infantry at the base of the hills before speeding north to escape artillery fire. Horse-drawn wagons that hours earlier had carried supplies now carried ammunition for the assault. The once fragmented German forces were, for the first time in days, acting with coherence. The Americans felt the shift. By late morning, German infantry had penetrated several forward positions on the lower slopes. The fighting became hand-to-hand, grenades, bayonets, close-range bursts of automatic fire. Dust and smoke clouded everything. Truscott, understanding the gravity of the situation, ordered immediate reinforcement. Elements of the 36th Infantry Division, still arriving after days of forced marches, were rushed onto the ridgelines. Their entry changed the rhythm of the battle. Fresh rifle companies began to fill the gaps, stabilizing sectors that were moments from collapse. Artillery played the decisive role. American observers, even under brutal pressure, continued to relay corrections to the batteries positioned miles behind the front. The howitzers responded with ruthless efficiency, delivering shells along pre-plotted fire lanes that carved into the German assault formations. The explosions rolled across the valley like sustained thunder, breaking up the cohesion of the attack. Then, the tide turned. Just after noon, German commanders received devastating news. Elements of their retreating column north of Montélimar were under attack from French armored units and American cavalry forces. Their escape route was narrowing. Staying in Montélimar to break the American line had become a gamble with diminishing odds. The breakout attempt began to falter. German infantry, seeing their flanks exposed, started to pull back. Panzer crews, low on fuel and ammunition, withdrew to avoid encirclement. The assault that had nearly split the American positions now crumbled under the combined weight of artillery, fresh reinforcements, and the looming threat of total entrapment. Yet victory came at a cost. The Americans had held, but barely. Casualties were significant. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors. Sherman crews reported firing their last rounds before supply trucks finally reached them. Engineers had worked through shellfire to keep roads open, and the artillery, the backbone of the defense, was running dangerously low on ammunition. Still, the heights remained in American hands. As night fell on August 23, the battlefield around Montélimar was a landscape of smoking wreckage, spent casings, overturned equipment, and bodies, German and American alike. The German breakout had failed. The Americans had not sealed the trap completely, but they had done enough to cripple the German retreat. For the first time, Army Group G understood the truth. Their escape was no longer guaranteed. And the Americans, bloodied but unbroken, were tightening the vise. The morning of August 24 revealed a transformed battlefield. The hills east of Montélimar, where the fiercest fighting had taken place, were littered with shell craters, burned-out vehicles, and abandoned equipment. Smoke still drifted across the valley from fires set during the previous day's fighting, some ignited by artillery strikes, others deliberately set by German units trying to destroy sensitive documents before retreating. But below the ridges, something far more telling appeared. The German column had lost its shape. What had once been a long, tense procession moving northward under pressure was now broken into clusters, some stationary, some attempting to flee, others simply milling in confusion. The German command structure, strained from days of non-stop retreat and fragmented communication, had finally cracked. American reconnaissance units were among the first to recognize the shift. Cavalry patrols pushing westward from the heights began encountering small groups of German soldiers moving without clear direction, some carrying wounded, others traveling on foot with little more than their rifles and canteens. These were not organized formations. They were remnants. The Americans seized the moment. Truscott ordered his forces to intensify pressure along the entire front. Artillery officers resumed bombardments with cold efficiency, striking known choke points along the Rhône. Every intersection, every bridge approach, and every field used for temporary encampment became a target. The effect was immediate and devastating. German vehicles, already low on fuel and suffering mechanical failures, were forced to divert off main roads into side paths unsuited for heavy traffic. Trucks bogged down in soft earth. Horse-drawn wagons overturned on uneven ground. Staff cars, unable to maneuver, were abandoned wholesale. And everywhere, German soldiers traversed the fields on foot, many discarding equipment in an effort to move faster. For Army Group G, this was the unraveling. American infantry exploited the chaos with practiced precision. The 3rd Division expanded its hold on the eastern heights, sending battalion-sized elements down into the valley to cut small roads feeding the highway. The 36th Division pressed hard on the southern edge of the corridor, forcing German units into smaller and smaller pockets. French armored elements, bold and aggressive, launched rapid strikes on isolated German clusters, capturing prisoners and disrupting any attempt at reorganizing. At the tactical level, resistance persisted. German machine gun teams fought with remarkable tenacity, covering withdrawals with disciplined bursts that echoed across the valley. Mortar crews, low on ammunition, fired only when American infantry closed within a few hundred meters. These defensive knots inflicted casualties and slowed the U.S. advance, but they no longer shaped the battle. The operational momentum had passed decisively to the Americans. In the German command posts, many of them relocated multiple times as the front collapsed. Reports were chaotic. Some officers insisted the Americans were attempting to encircle the entire German presence in the south. Others argued for a breakout to the east, abandoning vehicles and crossing the Rhône on improvised rafts. Fuel shortages meant only a fraction of armored vehicles could still move. Communications with higher headquarters were sporadic at best. By mid-morning, a grim realization set in. There would be no coordinated breakout, only survival. American forces continued squeezing the valley. Artillery batteries pushed forward, establishing new firing positions closer to the river. Cavalry units cut small farm roads the Germans had been using to bypass the main highway. Air support from carrier-based aircraft struck any remaining concentrations of vehicles, forcing German units to disperse even further. The scale of the collapse grew more evident with each hour. Entire German regiments disintegrated into groups of dozens. Officers lost contact with their companies. Ammunition ran dangerously low. Water became scarce. Every kilometer northward was contested, not by American roadblocks alone, but by exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless pressure of U.S. firepower. And yet, the Germans continued to retreat, not in disciplined columns, but in waves of fragmented groups, moving north through vineyards, orchards, and the dry riverbeds that lined the Rhône. By early evening, American forward elements reached positions that allowed them to interdict the last remaining German escape lanes north of Montélimar. Artillery fire intensified once more, sending ripples of explosions across the valley floor. The Germans who had not yet escaped realized the magnitude of their predicament. They were caught between retreat and annihilation. The battle for Montélimar was not over, but its outcome was no longer uncertain. The cohesion of the German retreat had collapsed. What remained was an exhausted army fighting to escape destruction, and an American force determined to turn operational advantage into strategic victory. By August 25, the German retreat through the Montélimar corridor had transformed from a structured withdrawal into a survival march. The once orderly column had broken into ragged lines of soldiers, carts, motorcycles, staff cars, and the occasional tank limping forward with barely enough fuel to keep moving. Their objective was simple: reach Lyon. Anything less meant annihilation. But the Americans were determined to deny them even that. Throughout the night of August 24th to 25th, artillery fire continued to rain down on the valley. American batteries shifted their fire northward, targeting new pockets of German movement as reconnaissance teams identified them. Illumination rounds burst in the sky, casting eerie white light over the fields and revealing groups of German troops attempting to move in the darkness. Some froze in place, unsure whether they had been seen. Others broke into a run, hoping to reach the next patch of cover before the shells landed. Even in the midst of this chaos, the Germans retained a remarkable ability to improvise. Officers gathered scattered soldiers into ad hoc Kampfgruppen. Machine gun teams were redeployed to cover temporary defensive lines. Horse-drawn artillery, once seen as an anachronism, proved invaluable, as it did not depend on dwindling fuel reserves. But these efforts only slowed the American pressure; they could not reverse it. The Americans, for their part, understood they were fighting the clock as much as the enemy. Every hour that passed allowed more German troops to slip through the northern gap. General Truscott faced a difficult choice: commit more infantry to close the trap completely, or maintain the rapid northward momentum needed to secure crossings further up the Rhône. He chose momentum. The 3rd Infantry Division continued to tighten its grip on the eastern heights, while the 36th Division pushed aggressively into the valley, engaging scattered German units with disciplined precision. French armored forces, particularly elements of the 1st Armored Division, executed rapid thrusts along secondary roads, intercepting retreating German groups and engaging them with aggressive flanking maneuvers. Still, the Germans were not yet defeated. On the afternoon of August 25th, they mounted a final, desperate delaying action just south of Loriol. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, running on fumes, established a thin defensive line along a series of vineyard terraces. Their task was thankless: hold the Americans back long enough for the bulk of the German remnants to escape north. 4 hours, they succeeded. Sherman's advancing through the valley encountered determined resistance. German anti-tank guns, concealed among low stone walls, fired accurately, forcing American armor to maneuver carefully. Mortars and machine guns cracked across the fields, and German snipers used the vineyards for concealment, slowing the American infantry advance. Yet behind the German line, the retreat was collapsing under its own weight. Vehicles jammed the narrow roads leading north. Refugee groups mingled with military units. Horses fell from exhaustion. Engines overheated. Crates of ammunition were discarded in ditches to lighten loads. The once proud German formations were now shadows of themselves, moving out of instinct rather than coordination. As evening approached, American artillery shifted its fire once more, striking the nodes where German traffic funneled into the final escape route. The results were devastating. Trucks burned, their flames curling into the twilight. Wagons overturned. Columns stalled. German officers tried to direct traffic by hand, waving soldiers forward with gestures that betrayed their desperation. By nightfall, the last large elements of the German force managed to break free and continue toward Lyon. They had escaped destruction, but at a staggering cost. Thousands had been captured or killed, and their equipment losses were catastrophic. The remnants of Army Group G that reached Lyon were exhausted, disorganized, and barely capable of forming a defensive line. For the Americans, the outcome was clear. Montélimar had not been a perfect encirclement, but it had achieved the strategic objective. It had shattered German cohesion, destroyed vast quantities of equipment, and turned the retreat into a rout. The valley was theirs. And with the Montélimar corridor broken, the path to Lyon, and beyond, lay open. The 7th Army was already moving toward it. By August 26th, the remnants of the German forces fleeing the Montélimar corridor were pushing north in a state of exhaustion that bordered on collapse. Their uniforms were covered in dust, their formations fragmented, and their vehicles, those that still ran, were held together by wire, hope, and dwindling fuel. Ahead of them lay Lyon. Behind them marched the U.S. 7th Army. The American columns wasted no time consolidating their position at Montélimar. Engineers cleared destroyed vehicles from the valley roads and repaired bridges damaged in the fighting. The speed of these repairs was remarkable. Within hours, routes that had been impassable due to smoking wreckage were reopened to allow the armored spearheads to press north. Truscott's orders were unmistakable. Maintain constant pressure, give the Germans no time to regroup. The 3rd Infantry Division advanced along the eastern bank of the Rhône, while elements of the 36th Infantry Division and French armored units pushed up the valley floor. The terrain changed subtly as they moved, vineyards giving way to broader plains, and the distant hills forming a natural corridor that pointed directly toward Lyon. German rearguards attempted to delay the advance but lacked the strength for sustained combat. Small groups of machine gunners fired from hedgerows and farmhouses before falling back in haste. Anti-tank guns, positioned along the road, fired a few desperate rounds before being abandoned when American tanks maneuvered to flank them. Every hour, the pursuit intensified. American reconnaissance aircraft flew low over the valley, relaying German positions to artillery units that had now positioned themselves well within range of the retreating column. The artillery fire was relentless, narrowing the corridor, breaking up convoys, and forcing German units off the roads. Smoke rose in scattered plumes along the valley floor, marking the spots where vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. For the Germans, the retreat had lost any semblance of organization. Messages from Army Group G headquarters were sporadic, often arriving hours late. Commanders struggled to form coherent defensive lines, lacking both manpower and fuel. Vehicles ran dry and were left on the roadside with their engines still warm. Infantry marched until their legs refused to continue, then rested in ditches before staggering forward again. Some German units attempted to establish defensive positions on the heights south of Lyon, but these efforts were undermined by a new factor: the French resistance. Across the region, resistance groups had mobilized with astonishing coherence. They cut telephone lines, ambushed small German detachments, and reported troop movements directly to the Americans. In several cases, they liberated villages before American forces even arrived, forcing German rearguards to navigate a maze of hostile territory. Meanwhile, the Americans maintained a steady operational rhythm. The 7th Army had perfected the art of fast, flexible pursuit, infantry and tanks advancing in alternating bounds, artillery leapfrogging forward to maintain constant fire support, and engineers repairing obstacles with improvisational skill. By August 27th, American units had reached towns just south of Lyon. Scenes along the way reflected the exhaustion of the German retreat: abandoned anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward, field kitchens overturned, columns of soldiers walking in silence, occasionally protected by small detachments of machine gunners who fired with mechanical precision before melting away into the countryside. But the closer the Germans came to Lyon, the clearer it became that they could no longer hold even the illusion of a defensive line. Lyon, France's second-largest city, was too vast to defend with the shattered remnants of Army Group G. Its bridges spanned the wide Saône and Rhône rivers, but many of them were clogged with abandoned vehicles or prepared for demolition. German commanders, realizing they lacked the manpower to hold the city, issued orders for an accelerated withdrawal. American forces moved to intercept. On August 28, reconnaissance elements of the 3rd Division reached the outskirts of Lyon, finding German defenders preparing to flee. Small firefights erupted, but the Germans had no intention of being encircled. They withdrew northward, leaving behind depots, vehicles, and supply caches. This time, retreat became flight. By August 29, French forces of the interior entered Lyon amid celebrations from the civilian population. The American 7 Corps secured the area shortly afterward, freeing Truscott's divisions to continue north. The collapse of German control in southern France was now complete. Operation Dragoon had done more than open a second front. It had shattered the German presence across an entire region, liberated hundreds of kilometers of territory, and transformed the Rhône Valley into an open highway for the Allied advance. And the Americans were preparing to drive even farther, toward the link-up with forces from Normandy. By early September 1944, the transformation initiated by Operation Dragoon was unmistakable. What had begun as a meticulously engineered amphibious landing on the beaches of Provence had become an unstoppable northbound surge, an Allied army advancing along a new axis of attack the Germans had never anticipated. From the Mediterranean shoreline to the streets of Lyon, the U.S. 7th Army had crossed more than 500 kilometers of varied terrain in just over 2 weeks. And now, its momentum was directed toward a single objective: linking up with American and British forces advancing from Normandy. This junction, though often overshadowed in popular memory, represented one of the most decisive strategic convergences of the entire European war. As the 7th Army moved north along the Rhône and Saône valleys, the German defense fractured even further. Army Group G attempted to regroup near Dijon, but the strains of continuous retreat, fuel shortages, shattered logistics, broken command structures, made it impossible to establish a coherent line. German reports from early September spoke of divisions reduced to collections of marching groups, with some battalions mustering fewer than 100 men. The Americans advanced in disciplined leaps. Mechanized units pushed ahead in pursuit mode, supported by artillery that had now moved so far inland that its forward observers were spotting targets among the same kinds of fields and villages that the forces from Normandy were already passing. For the Germans, there was no safe direction. North meant the path of the U.S. 3rd Army, west meant the British 2nd Army, and east meant the growing threat of Allied units pushing toward the Vosges. The link-up finally occurred on September 12, near Montbard and Dijon. Patrols from the 7th Army made contact with elements of Patton's 3rd Army, completing a strategic clamp that sealed the fate of German forces trapped between two converging fronts. In that moment, the Allied invasion of Western Europe became a unified machine. Dragoon, initially controversial, overshadowed by the drama of Normandy, had now demonstrated its full operational power. By opening a broad southern front, the Americans had achieved several critical outcomes. They denied the Germans the ability to reinforce or resupply Normandy. Every division that might have fought against the Overlord landings was instead destroyed or scattered in southern France. They liberated vital ports. Marseille and Toulon, captured in the latter stages of Dragoon, became operational far faster than anyone predicted. Within weeks, they were unloading more supplies per day than all the beaches of Normandy combined, a logistical revolution that sustained the Allied advance into Germany. They severed the German defense in France. Army Group G's retreat was no longer a controlled withdrawal, it was a collapse accelerated by pressure from two flanks. They opened a direct route into the heart of Europe. The Rhône Valley became a natural corridor for the Allied push eastward, allowing the U.S. 7th Army to support operations in the Vosges, the Saar, and eventually across the Rhine. Strategically, Dragoon changed the geometry of the war. What had been a single, concentrated front after D-Day became a broad, expanding arc of Allied strength, pressing simultaneously from north and south. The Germans, lacking reserves and mobility, were forced into defensive reactions rather than coherent planning. The southern approach also stretched their supply lines, complicating any effort to reinforce the rapidly collapsing Western Front. By the autumn of 1944, the effects of Dragoon were visible across the entire map of Europe. The liberation of southern France had accelerated the timetable of the war, closed a major escape route for German forces, and created the conditions for a sustained multi-axis assault that would carry the Allies to the borders of the Reich itself. But for the men who had begun this journey on the waters of the Mediterranean, infantry, tank crews, engineers, sailors, pilots, paratroopers, the memory of Provence was never distant. They remembered the quiet dawn of August 15th, the ridgelines above Montélimar, the heat, the dust, the thunder of artillery in the Rhône Valley. They remembered the moment the southern door opened. And they walked through it, determined, exhausted, and unstoppable. Operation Dragoon had begun as an invasion. It ended as an axis of victory.